Political liberalism is typically grounded on the assumption that the maximization of negative freedom is beneficial for society and for individuals because they, more often than not, make rational choices. They imagine that it is unnecessary to constrain individual choice and liberty because in aggregate, individual decisions can provide information necessary to support complex systems. But just as easily as this is assumed, it can be dismissed. Everyday lived experience proves how irrational humans can be, whether that be questionable dating decisions or impulsive financial decisions like going into debt for consumer goods. Thus, it would be fruitful in the war against liberalism to show the weakness of rational choice theory. What rational choice theory posits is that humans will act to rationally maximize their own preferences. It is to some extent agnostic regarding what those preferences are, other than to assert that they will be consistent and self-beneficial. Furthermore, it assumes that humans act as individuals, that they perform rational cost-benefit analysis when confronted with choices, and that they are essentially egoists, considering only their own self-benefit. Rational choice theory assumes that man is homo economicus, or economic man, who seeks to maximize his own self-benefit without respect to other factors or people. Here, I will show that these assumptions are wrong. Decision-making does not always involve an opportunity to reason beforehand. Humans often do not even know what their preferences actually are. Those preferences often are inconsistent. People do not act in an individualist vacuum, and humans are fundamentally social beings rather than being egoists. And ultimately, the assumption of homo economicus is untenable in the face of the fact that people tend to consider morality and other values when making decisions. First of all, human decision-making is just more complex than rational choice theory assumes. Kahneman in 2002 posited that humans have basically two modes of thinking, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast and reflexive, giving little time to think rationally, while System 2 is slow, methodical, and rational. In a lot of decision scenarios, many people are System 1 type thinkers. They rely on intuition and quick judgments to decide what's best. In his paper, Kahneman showed that in most situations, people rely on this intuition to make decisions, more so than slow rational thinking. A shockingly large part of human decision-making actually occurs in the preconscious mind. Proponents of RCT like to imagine a hypothetical person who always consciously evaluates the alternatives in a choice scenario. However, the assumption is basically something of a fantasy. Even George Soros makes decisions based on gut feelings. Traders often justify their choices saying they experienced a gut feeling. These experiences of feelings are driven by intuitions and are often accompanied by physiological changes. For example, George Soros, founder of the hedge fund Quantum Capital, confessed that he relied on a great deal of what he called animal instincts. He said, "When I was actively running the fund, I suffered from a backache. I used the onset of acute pain as a signal that there was something wrong in my portfolio." While it may be strange to think that traders such as George Soros have relied on unknown influences to navigate their investment choices, this phenomenon of relying on gut feelings is not specific to him or the financial industry, as the majority of people use hunches every day to make choices. Human choice behavior also tends toward irrationality. Contrary to the demands of rationality, however, human choice behavior has been observed to violate both regularity and Lewis's choice axiom. Most of the existing literature on this point arises from the field of marketing and consumer behavior, where the implications of choice alternative effects hold considerable interest. For example, entrepreneurs have long believed that introducing a product to a marketplace consisting of two competing items would detrimentally draw consumers from the existing product closest to the new competition, and companies tend to diversify their own products in an effort to minimize cannibalization. RCT also fundamentally ignores the tendency of humans to involve or be affected by emotionality during decision-making. Several examples exist demonstrating that emotions can drive humans to make ultimately irrational decisions, such as avoiding the use of airplanes due to a fear of flying, primed by images of a plane crash, or anger driving gamblers to accept high-risk, high-reward options. RCT assumes that actors are isolated individuals acting alone, and yet people are communally influenceable, such as in advertising or propaganda. For example, when a choice is framed in terms of gain rather than loss, people are more risk-seeking, such has been found in Kahneman and Tversky, 1979. Values are not always rational nor economic. The tendency of people to reject self-serving deals on account of upset fairness for example, means that in a game situation, people might end up going empty-handed because the rational solution to the game is unfair, i.e. lending only as little money as possible to other players to maximize self-benefit, as was found in Hardy Valley 2007. Tests of traders show that even if traders report making rational cost-benefit analysis, their actual trading behavior does not reflect that. During the 2008 financial crisis, traders indicated that they were less risk-averse on average than their actual trading behavior demonstrated, as was found in Weber and Clement's 2018 paper. RCT is founded on the assumption that a person knows his own preferences or values with certainty. However, in politics, this is often untrue. In Democracy for Realists, which Keith Woods covered in a video, I'll link in the description, the authors showed that there are also profound framing effects that demonstrate the average voter does not well understand his own political preferences. In the 1980s, 65% of Americans said the federal government was spending too little to assist the poor, while only 20 to 25% said it was spending too little on welfare. In that book, there are countless other examples of problems of a similar nature. For example, people show little consistency in political belief and party affiliation. We can presume that this tendency is not just limited to politics and might be expanded to economic choices as well. Despite RCT leading us to believe that a market actor would purchase the best competing product, people often exhibit brand loyalty, which is irrational. With the breadth of financial choices available for people to make, can we really trust that they actually know that they want to get into debt, for example? Furthermore, individualism is the assumed starting point, but in reality, a person does not have preferences in a vacuum. RCT ignores the complex web of institutional media and propaganda designed specifically to alter people's personal preferences, as well as social pressures and networking effects, and said alterations might not necessarily lead to a person's rational self-benefit. Mass immigration is now popular on the left, and acceptance of legal immigration is well entrenched on the mainstream right. This is despite the fact that demographic replacement poses no self-benefit to our people. Framing this in terms of rational choice obscures the actual problem and the forces that modify a person's behavior at a base level. Many liberal proponents of rational choice theory like to imagine that it's scientific or values-free, which is how they imagine economics as a whole, as an objective and neutral science. However, RCT, due to its egoism, necessarily supposes that a person ought to maximize his own power and wealth. The principle of quantity and the fact of massive individual wealth accumulation is never questioned, and it is never thought that these could have a negative consequence for a society, the consolidation of wealth in the hands of a small elite whose allegiances and interests are never checked. RCT takes the conditions of capitalism as the default and assumes that any alternative is irrational because it might not lead to the maximization of personal wealth. However, there are obviously many arguments one could make that rationally suppose that wealth maximization can be harmful to society. Marxists stress the contradiction of overproduction, which makes it impossible for manufacturers to continue increasing profits after having increased production, leading to a decline in economic conditions. Reactionaries argue that societies based on wealth begin to displace traditional values, and in their place, it installs the reign of quantity and its consequential dehumanization. Both Marxists and reactionaries point out how alienating life is under the conditions of capitalism and its insistence on an asceticism of wealth and productivity. Given that the set of values is much more broad than RCT lets on, we can only conclude that proponents of RCT adhere to it mainly because they already adhere to its assumed values of labor, wealth, class, consumption, and production. They already think man is homo economicus rather than the image of God or the member of an oppressed production class. So the fact that capitalism leads to dehumanization does not appear to cause any concern to them. For us, however, we can see through this self-imposed darkness. We know that it's rational to value more than the almighty dollar. Now, of course, it would be absurd to deny that rational choice theory, under certain circumstances and conditions, can make accurate predictions. A person who owns a business isn't going to be that likely to deliberately make a decision that sabotages himself economically. A person who invests for a living is going to be more likely to make decisions that make economic sense. But beyond this narrow situation, there's an abundance of circumstances in which people do not make rational choices. In politics and consumer economics, there are intense framing effects. Even in trading are there framing effects. When liberals take for gospel a theory that only has such narrow applicability and then assume that it must be true for voters, politicians, and rulers in society as a whole, they have stepped outside the very environment in which this rule has any validity, and not to mention all those traders who, even in the right environment, refused to make an investment because they walked under a ladder or saw a black cat on the way to work. The modern notion that the masses should be included in the political process and should be relatively unconstrained economically butts up against the traditional understanding that the masses tended to be quite irrational. In the past, governments were restricted such that political power was restricted to the nobility, which was selected on the basis of purity, honor, morality, and implicitly on intelligence. It was recognized that if the masses were to take power, it would lead to a decline in civilization and values. The caste system and the structure of feudalism ensured that only those with the right set of values and the right approach to decision-making could wield power. Of course, as with any political system, it wasn't perfect, and kings sometimes made irrational decisions or became decadent, such as was the case in Rome with emperors such as Nero, or in the age of absolutism, in which monarchs would indebt themselves to foreigners. However, the general project of distrusting the wisdom of the masses and the basic assumption that the average person is not a rational individual actor ensured the preservation of values. The assumption of the rational choice of the individual is the liberal justification for democracy. However, despite the warnings of its progenitors, it is essentially founded on the inversion of this distrust. It has resulted in a gradual unraveling of civilization socially and economically. Libertarians tend to stress the role of democracy in the expansion of the welfare state. As Stefan Molyneux repeatedly noted, people with a higher time preference, i.e., I want it now, will tend to vote for socialist welfare policies, and there are an awful lot more low to average IQ people with high time preferences than high IQ people with low time preferences in the population. Under conditions of demographic replacement, the problem becomes exacerbated. Though I'm not personally opposed to a welfare policy and a nationalist schema, the people who vote for welfare expansion also tend to vote for immigration expansion as well, which is unsustainable and irrational and cannot but be a recipe for economic disaster. The masses regularly choose candidates who offer destructive policies, such as those that heighten racial tensions. Even the Republican base in the United States continues to vote for pro-Zionist policy, which causes the deaths of countless people, on top of costing us billions of dollars a year and getting us entangled into ethnic disputes. The masses are easily manipulated by those who hold power, who appeal to the sub-rational part of our basic humanity, which is a Pandora's box that liberals always ignore in lieu of an optimistic trust in the rational part. We cannot afford the continuation of this silly process. Relying on the goodwill and supposed reason of humanity has led to open borders, socialism, economic expropriation, racial tension, and much worse. Really, choices should be made by those who have the intelligence and virtue to be responsible. In other words, not made by the masses. In order to right this sinking ship, it is necessary to abandon the false messiah of rational choice and once again begin restricting those choices. The availability of cheap and easy finance, they literally send you credit cards in the mail and insolvency is only a phone call away, has ruined too many lives. Democracy has debased our civilization for too long. Without the basic recognition that the human tendency is toward irrationality, no limitation of choice is possible. The liberal negative liberty that modern people hold so dear must be abolished once and for all.